Hello, welcome. Can everyone hear? Sorry, I'll just talk up a little. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing. Can you all hear me? Okay, terrific. Hello, welcome. My name's Damien Carrick. I present the Law Report program, which is the weekly legal current affairs show on ABC Radio National. On behalf of the organisers of this event, the Caston Centre for Human Rights Law, which is based at Monash University, welcome. This evening's pre-election forum is an opportunity to look at where and how human rights fit in the election platforms of our major parties. Well, some of our major parties. Unfortunately, Attorney General Rob Hulls is not here this evening. He initially agreed to participate. Indeed, given his busy schedule, this date was chosen to suit his timetable. However, 2 weeks ago, on the Monday following the federal election, his office informed the organisers that he wouldn't be participating, citing a clash with other commitments. The organisers then requested that the AG's office nominate a replacement so that the ALP could participate in this forum, but that request was declined. However, this evening we are joined by Robert Clark MP, the Victorian Shadow Attorney General, and he's also the Shadow Minister for Finance. Robert Clark is the member for Box Hill. He's been a Member of Parliament since 1988. Since 2007, he's been a member of the All-Party Law Reform Committee of the Parliament. Before entering politics, Robert Clark was a solicitor practising in commercial, financial and labour law. Robert's interests include the interaction of economics, social policy and the law, and also the use of information technology to overcome economic, political and other barriers. We're also joined by Brian Walters SC, the Greens candidate for the lower house seat of Melbourne. Brian Walters is a prominent human rights advocate. Back in 1992, he was one of the founders of the Victorian Greens. He was made Senior Counsel, or QC, in 2001, and he served as both Vice President and President of human rights group Liberty Victoria. He's also one of the founders of Wild, which is Australia's wilderness adventure magazine. Now, whatever the reason, it is really a great shame that Rob Hulls isn't here this evening to defend and articulate the ALP's record on justice and human rights issues. That record includes, putting aside the ACT, Victoria is the only state to have introduced a Charter for Human Rights and Responsibilities. And that record also includes an approach to law and order issues, such as sentencing and incarceration, which is considerably less shrill than many other parts of Australia. And whether that's to do with his government or the general culture and all the parties, it's a matter for discussion. The obvious starting point for this evening's discussion is the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities, how the candidates think it's worked so far, whether or not they would keep it, and whether or not they would reform it or expand it. Oh, a bit closer to me? Yeah? How's that? Okay, testing. How does that? Can you hear me? Is that better? Okay. Testing. That's okay? All right. Keep talking? You can hear? Okay. Really? Okay. Well, I can talk a bit louder if that helps. Okay. The obvious starting point for this evening's discussion is the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities, how the candidates think it's worked so far, whether or not they would keep it, and whether or not they would reform it or expand it. Robert Clark, when the Charter was originally introduced into Parliament, the opening line of your second reading speech was, quote, "This bill is hypocritical and dangerous." What did you mean by that? And 4 years on, do you still maintain that view?
The short answer is yes. It's hypocritical because the government purports to uphold rights through the legislation, but in practice it will resort to any device it can find to get around the Charter. And indeed I think there's an argument that can be made that the Charter itself in Victoria is inconsistent with, for example, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, particularly in the way the government applies it in the Parliament. Clause 7.2, now section 7.2 of the bill, is a general get-out clause which says that any of the rights so-called set out in the Charter can be abrogated if effectively justified in a free and democratic society. And if anybody reads through the statements of compatibility that the government delivers ahead of any bill in the Parliament, you'll see the government resorts very freely to that to justify more or less whatever it wants to. Now, with the Court of Appeal decision a few months ago, they may need to reconsider that process and that practice, but to date the bill has not been complied with even in spirit by the government, and you can also go through it clause by clause and pick up a range of ways in which, even ignoring section 7.2, it doesn't comply with the international covenant for no particular reason. So in other words, the government has selected what it is going to deem to be so-called human rights for Victoria. Now, dangerous, it gives a false sense that it's doing something useful to uphold rights, but in fact it is taking away potentially a large range of matters which should be policy issues for public debate and for decision by Parliament through the democratic process, risks putting the courts in the role of being policy makers. Now, the Court of Appeal has sought to take a step back from that in the Monsilovic decision. It will be interesting to see what comes out of the High Court on that, but certainly I stand by both of those propositions that the legislation introduced was hypocritical and is dangerous.
Just for everybody's benefit, the Momcilovic decision was the court found that there was an incompatibility or inconsistency between the Charter and the legislation, but it said, okay, back to you, Parliament. The court didn't change the laws, it simply said, back to you, Parliament. Well, Robert Clark, $64 million question. You're on the public record saying that a coalition government would repeal the Charter. Is that your position if you win at the upcoming election?
Well, we haven't announced a formal policy position going into the election, but I can certainly say that the Charter would not be continuing in its current form. One option would be to repeal it entirely. Another option would be to move to a model more akin to that announced by the Commonwealth Government and Commonwealth Attorney General Robert McClelland in terms of focusing human rights at a parliamentary level. In other words, subjecting proposed laws before the Parliament to scrutiny and report as to whether or not they comply with Australia's international treaty obligations, but leaving the ultimate policy decision to Parliament and to the democratic process.
So no oversight by the courts?
So if you follow that model, then it would be a matter for Parliament to make those decisions.
Brian Walters, what's your view of the Charter?
I think the Charter's been a really important step forward in human rights, not only in Victoria but indeed in Australia. We are the only Western nation never to have enacted the rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as part of the law of the land. The Charter is the first state step in doing that comprehensively. It's still not complete, but it's a great step forward. I think we should say too, observe that 4 years on, the doomsayers have been proved wrong. We were told that there would be a judicial revolution. That hasn't happened. We were told there would be a tsunami of litigation. That hasn't happened. We were told that it would be a get out of jail free card for criminals. It hasn't been that. Where it has been effective has been for people like those who are mentally ill, or those who are disabled, or in other ways marginalised in the community. So the first declaration of incompatibility was in the Crack decision, where Mr Crack's status as an involuntary patient under the Mental Health Act hadn't been reviewed for 2 years. And as a result of that decision, the whole procedures of the Mental Health Review Board have been altered. And it's in those kinds of ways, delivery of services to even the most marginal, that the Charter has proved its worth already as an important way of affirming the dignity of the human person, particularly for those who otherwise would be powerless.
Well, Brian Walters, we've heard from Robert Clark that he's not quite telling us exactly, but he would